14, 1948, Israel officially declared its independence. The next day, exactly 60 years ago, then-President Harry Truman and the U.S. recognized the State of Israel. After he left office, President Truman spoke about his decision to push for an independent Jewish state. This program is part of a series called Decision, The Conflicts of Harry S. Truman. This is 25 Minutes.
In the beginning, it was called Palestine, a place of beginnings. Here, three great religions were born, each in its own way based on the law of one God. Love thy neighbor as thyself. And here, for thousands of years, because his neighbors called God by another name, the believers of one religion slaughtered the worshipers of another. In 1948, one group wanted to return to their place of worship, and another terrible war exploded. Ladies and gentlemen, the 33rd President of the United States, Harry S. Truman.
No problem I faced while I was President of the United States was more controversial or more complex than the problem of Israel. In 1948, I was up to here in experts from the Army, the Navy, and the State Department.
The experts of the United Kingdom and the Arabian experts all threatened dire consequences if the United States recognized the newly formed State of Israel.
I was told by all these so-called experts that if it was done, it would involve the whole Near East in a war, and it would also involve the United States.
The Arabs demanded the Jews leave Palestine. The English wanted to keep the status quo.
Our State Department and Chiefs of Staff didn't want to antagonize the Arabs. All the oil-consuming countries wanted to placate the Arabs so they get their hands on that oil, the most valuable oil deposit in the world, anywhere. And the Jews didn't want any compromise. I don't know what you're going to do in a fix of that kind.
In 1948, the President of the United States sat on a powder keg. He and he alone had to determine whether to recognize the newly formed State of Israel in the face of Arab military threat. His State Department told him the fuse was already lit. The British warned him that his decision could explode the whole Middle East in a raging war.
I had to take a look at myself for the simple reason I was trying to find out why a Midwest Baptist like me should get so emotionally upset over Palestine and the fate of the Jews and their terrible position in the world. I knew how they felt.
Yes, the President knew how they felt. In a strange twist of fate, members of his own family had been displaced during the American Civil War.
My grandmother and my mother have told me many stories about what happened to the people who lived between Kansas and Missouri, how they were moved off their homes, as many goods and chattels as the federal soldiers thought they ought to have, loaded into a wagon and taken into town, where they had to stay all the time while the war was going on. I had some notion of what these people were going through who had to be moved from one place to another in order to have a home. And I was very anxious that they would not and should not have to go through the same sort of difficulties that the families in the war between the states had to go through. It was my attitude that the American government couldn't stand idly by while the victims of Hitler's madness were not allowed to build new lives. Hitler had been murdering Jews right and left. It's estimated that he killed 6 million Jews and burned most of them up in furnaces. It was a horrible thing. I saw it, and I dream about it even to this day. And on that account, the Jews needed some place where they could go.
These tired, wandering people, rejected everywhere else, wanted to go home, the homeland promised by ancient prophets and modern statesmen. But there were always obstacles placed in their way. Modern obstacles.
Some of these unfortunate human beings ran from one tragedy right into another. Some of them were killed almost on the doorstep of their homeland. The homeland was promised to them by the League of Nations mandate. The Balfour Declaration had also made that same sort of a promise. Mandate provided create an atmosphere in which a Jewish homeland could grow.
In their desire to find new life, the Jews had thrown off the dark, narrow cloak of politics. They worked like pioneers to awaken a desert that had been dead for hundreds of years. They made it bloom. They made the desert live. But they were always shrouded in a veil of world politics. They lived in a kind of twilight, always impermanent, always caught in the confusion of political uncertainty.
You only had to read the Balfour Declaration and the mandate to see how vague they were. They were in such language that it could be interpreted in any way that anybody wanted to. And it was not the policy of the British to create a commonwealth or a government for the Jews. No concrete effort was ever made to give them a place where they could really go and call it home. But I also thought that if we could set up a progressive situation in Palestine, it would be an example to the Arabs to do the same thing for their own countries.
The Arabs lived in the past. They feared change. The Arab chiefs especially feared a loss of power if the old feudal ways were changed by exposure to democracy.
But after 17 years of fuming and fussing by the Arabs and the Jews, the British government solved the problem by issuing a white paper. The white paper set a limit to the number of Jews that could immigrate to their homeland.
The Jews were plunged into a great stream of confusion, herded from camp to camp, reaching, always reaching for a homeland that grew more distant every day. President Truman knew the situation was growing more desperate and more critical hour by hour.
Some way had to be found to take care of those displaced persons, give them a place to live, something to eat, and something to wear. And it was up to us to try to get it done.
The president sent Earl G. Harrison to study at first hand the displaced people. Harrison's report could only try to be dispassionate.
It was a moving document, and it put a sting into my own feelings. And I sat down and wrote a letter to General Eisenhower. I told Ike that I couldn't stand that kind of misery in those camps, that I wanted him to do something about it.
General Eisenhower moved quickly in a deeply felt response.
Its deepest implication is in its eloquent protest against man's inhumanity to man. There is no word that can exaggerate the urgency. We must believe that man labors toward better things, that global action, creakingly and laboriously evolved by nations amidst human conflicts, engendered by prejudice, ignorance, misunderstanding, and distrust, will eventually eliminate recurrence of the tragedies you attempt to alleviate.
I got a letter off to Attlee and sent him a copy of the Harrison report and told him that we ought to start as fast as we could to repatriate as many of the Jews as we could in Israel. I thought the Near Eastern matter would eventually be settled, and I hoped it would be settled without war. That I didn't have any intention of sending 500,000 Americans over there to keep peace in the Near East. They ought to be able to keep their own peace.
But he knew in his heart the Jews would try to find a way to their homeland. There was no place else to go, and they decided to thrust into Palestine, their legal land, no matter what the British or Arabs could say or do to them. The Jews wanted their place in the world, a nation that could grow and build and contribute to the world. These were the descendants of Abraham and Moses, to whom God and Lord Balfour had promised this land. The Jews were responding to those promises. But the British had made a law and were carrying out their law with efficiency. It was not easy to slip through a British blockade. Forgetting Jewish sufferings under the Nazis, British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevins said, "The Jews have waited 2,000 years for a homeland. A little more time shouldn't matter."
That is a pretty raw, ignominious thing to say. When Bevin made that statement to me, and he added to it another statement that if I had not meddled with the thing, they would have had the thing settled. So that didn't help my Missouri good nature one little bit.
I need hardly tell you how much His Majesty's government deplore the state of unrest and disturbance into which Palestine has been plunged to the detriment of the interests and happiness of every community and indeed of every individual there.
The Jews, after every manner of sacrifice, managed to see and touch their promised community. But after one quick look, the British turned them around and shipped them to a new kind of camp on the island of Cyprus. There they were concentrated again. Here, loneliness could be contained. Longing could be put under guard. This, then, was freedom from the terrors of Hitler.
May the 14th, 1948, the British mandate was on the point of expiring, and the British had made up their minds that they would not follow through. The Arabs and Israelis were all ready to go to war. Well, meddling or not, I thought there ought to be one more try to avert war. I thought that the United Nations was the proper place for this thing to be handled. Warren Austin was our representative at the United Nations, and he was against the Jewish program almost entirely. And I called him up at the United Nations and told him exactly what I wanted and explained the whole situation to him. And he asked me some questions, and we discussed the matter back and forth. And after he knew what all the facts were, that was the right thing to do. He said, "Well, Mr. President, if you want it, I'll do everything I can to put it over."
It was on the initiative of His Majesty's government in the United Kingdom that the General Assembly placed the problem of Palestine's future government on its agenda.
The Arabs were ready. The only restraining force could be the United States and the United Nations.
The responsibilities of the Security Council in this situation are great.
The Security Council now has before it clear evidence that the Jews and Arabs of Palestine and the mandatory power cannot agree to implement the General Assembly plan of partition through peaceful means.
I repeat again that His Majesty's government have determined to base their policy on the assumption that they must lay down the mandate, under which they have sought for 25 years to discharge their obligations to fulfill the growth of the Jewish national home and to protect the interests of the Arab population.
The Jews could not wait to get rid of the British. In 1946, the extremists took over to create a wave of terror in Palestine. Violence burst forth out of frustration, out of concern for the millions of Jews still wasting away in Europe. The British were dying all over the globe in the final futile effort to save their fading empire. They had no other quarrel with the Jews other than the desire to retain their friendship with the oil-rich Arabs.
I knew the Jews weren't happy with those millions left in the camps, but I don't think they were acting for terror's sake. They wanted English out of Palestine, just like we wanted them out of the United States in 1776.
But the British fought back. They had their own traditions to follow. They turned Palestine into one single fortified camp to protect the mandate as long as it was to last.
The vote was coming up in the United Nations for the partition of Palestine, where this should be divided into Jewish and Arab states. There was no other basis. We had to divide the thing into two countries.
The Arab opposition to immigration and to the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine is not based on any racial prejudice against the Jews as Jews.
Neither the Jews nor the Arabs will ever be completely satisfied with anything we do.
It seemed there could be no agreement, no understanding. Each sound was colored by tradition, or prejudice, or hope, or disgust.
There should be thrown upon their shoulders a profoundly disturbing responsibility for a grave and far-reaching decision.
Gromyko saw Russia's future in the Middle East. President Truman ordered Ambassador Austin to cast the United States vote for the partition of Israel. The Arabs still clung to England. The Jews decided their own fate.
Administration, and not later than May 16th next, a provisional Jewish government will commence to function in cooperation with the representatives of the United Nations then in Palestine.
The kettle was boiling. The whole business was very discouraging. There was always worry of war in the Near East with the Arabs and the Jews. I used to tell them that if the Old Testament was correct, they were first cousins and relatives, and they ought to be able to get along if the rest of us could get along with them. And when the hate generations are all dead, they will do it. I wrote to an assistant as follows. I surely wish God Almighty would give the children of Israel an Isaiah, the Christians a St. Paul, and the sons of Ishmael a peep at the Golden Rule.
On May 14th, 1948, the British announced their mandate had ended in Palestine. The lowering of the British colors promised a bloodbath that the Middle East had not known for centuries. At least the overwhelming British power had forestalled the day of inevitable clash between the Arabs and Jews. Now the English were leaving. Palestine was for the strongest. But now there would be no English troops either to bolster the Arabs. The newly independent Jews were proud and hopeful. But their day of independence was not to signify an end of struggle. It was to be a new beginning of violence. On their day of independence, the new Jewish state was attacked on 5 sides by the Arabs. The Jews repelled the attacks, and the Arab civilians fled the country. One battle, the first of many, had been won by the infant nation. The new state of Israel was awaiting recognition from the United States. Without official recognition, all the vital elements of a state would be impossible. Military help, loans, trade. It was up to President Truman, and every faction was hammering at the White House door. Whose side would he take?
We'd just finished 2 wars, and we had a country of our own to put back on an even keel. I guess that's when I began to feel that the presidential chair was about the loneliest place that a man could be. And if you think that the president has somebody to pass the buck to, you're just as mistaken as you can be. I had a sign on my desk, if the buck stops here, it couldn't get any further. I gave orders that nobody was to come to see me and talk about the Palestine affair.
But one man could not accept the informal presidential order as a final decision. His name was Chaim Weizmann.
Dr. Chaim Weizmann had been trying to get in all along, and I wouldn't let him in. But someone did come to see me, and he got in. His name was Eddie Jacobson. You know, a lot of people have asked me, since I got back from the First World War, why I went into business with a Jew. I get exasperated when they ask me that, because a man's religion or his color has never had any effect on my feeling for him or my association with him. This man with whom I was in business was Eddie Jacobson, one of the finest men I ever had anything to do with. And he and I completely understood each other, and we offset each other. He was one of the best buyers that ever I came across, and I was one of the best salesmen that he ever had to be associated with. He came in, he stood around, didn't say very much, was as quiet as he could be, and I finally said, Eddie, what in the world's the matter with you? Have you at last come to get something? Well, because you never have asked me for anything since I've been in the White House and since we've been friends. And then he told me that he thought that I ought not to keep Dr. Weizmann out of the White House. He thought I ought to see him. And I told him that I would see the doctor, but he'd have to bring him in the side door. I didn't want any propaganda started on the thing. Dr. Weizmann's first name was C-H-A-I-M. And I didn't know how to pronounce it, so I called him Cham. Called him that to his face, and he liked it. He was a wonderful man, one of the wisest people I think I ever met. He was a leader, one of the kind that you read about and seldom see. Dr. Weizmann came to see me. We had a long, long conversation, and he explained the situation from his viewpoint, and I listened to him very carefully. And at the same time, I sent for Eddie Jacobson, and they both sat down and talked to me for a long, long time. When we were through, I said, all right, you 2 Jews have put it over on me, and I'm glad you have, for I like you both. On my desk at the White House, I used to keep a quotation from Mark Twain, which said, always do right. This will gratify some people and astonish the rest.
As was his habit, the president's final decision gratified a nation and astonished the world.
The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel.
I am extremely moved by the kind reception which you have accorded to me, and I take the first opportunity coming on these, stepping on the ground of this great capital, to express my heartfelt thanks, also on behalf of my wife and on behalf of my colleagues, to the President of the United